Anyway, I want to get back to the religion point because this is, a point you've been making for years now. And there's one piece in the Daily Beast, one in the Atlantic, that anti-racism takes on the character of a religion. And it's interesting to me that with your conversations with Glenn Lowry at Blogging Heads, which you're now known, it's kind of its own space for you and Glenn. Yeah. That's an interesting point of tension between you and Glenn, because whenever you talk about anti-racism as a religion, that certainly rings true to me, and I like that framing because there are so many similarities with how you're not supposed to ask pesky questions. There's a symmetry between original sin and white privilege. Mm-hmm. There's a kind of reverence for history in religion, as well as in
a mysterious future where everything is going to be resolved.
Right. There's reparations will be a reawakening, begins to sound somewhat like the rapture. But Glenn comes from more of a perspective that's more sympathetic to religion, so the analogy doesn't seem to quite do the same job in his mind that it does for yours.
Rubs him the wrong way. Yeah.
Right. But I was on a podcast a few months ago with my friend Yasha Monk, and we were talking about this, and he asked me a question that I thought was a very good one.
He asks good questions. Yeah.
He does, which is, so, assuming that there is a kind of religious impulse intrinsic to human beings, and given that Christianity is somewhat in decline, at least in the circles you and I would run in, mm-hmm. the circles that are being overtaken by anti-racism, mm-hmm. It's one thing to critique anti-racism as a religion, but it's another thing to say what would replace it, mm-hmm. given that there is a religion-shaped hole that needs to be filled with something. Mm-hmm. And I found that I came up with some answer, but mm-hmm. I didn't have a great answer.
Yeah, that's a tough one. It almost certainly is and I've thought about this quite a bit, actually. It's partly something that a secular person might almost viscerally crave. You almost seek the mysticism. You almost seek wanting to believe in something larger. Certainly you seek belonging. And whether you're white or black, all of those, high fives that people do when they, basically mention some anti-racist tenet or some analysis, that Alex McNabb was all about racism, right? And then you'll watch people do it. Mm. All of that is about connection. Mm. Yes, human beings need that. And I don't think it's an accident that rather, secular, even pagan, mostly overeducated, affluent whites are so Mormon-style religious about race. But to be honest, I'll give you a very chilly answer. I think that is, and I say this as an atheist. I don't like to talk about this too much, but that doesn't mean I don't talk about it at all. I do not believe in God at all. I am not agnostic. I am an atheist. And I don't feel bereft about it. And as far as I'm concerned, the anti-racist thing, to the extent that it's religious, and yes, I mean this, and I'm not going to walk it back, is a slide backwards. Mm. I think that humanity would be better off, it won't happen in my lifetime, humanity would be better off without religious thought of that kind, because that kind of thought is anti-empirical. I think we should be as comfortable as we can with empiricism and dealing with fact. I won't be writing a book arguing the point, but to the extent that people find anti-racism so attractive, it's because there's a part of us that reaches back to what we're founded upon, which is that we are social beings. That some people would argue that evolutionarily we almost need to believe in something beyond the mundane. It probably helps knit people together socially, which would have gotten passed down in genes. But if we're going to do what human beings do well and do it better, we've got to let go of anything that involves carefully turning a blind eye to facts in the quest for a warm but inchoate sense of belonging that, as often as not, impedes rather than fosters social justice. And so as far as I'm concerned, no, nothing should replace it, because there are a great many people who really aren't religious in any way who I wouldn't say are miserable, or if they are, it's not because they need to find Jesus, nor is it that they need to find, the priest's Ta-Nehisi codes or anything else. We just need to learn how to deal with reality. That's tough, but that is what I believe.
I think I have a bit of a disagreement with that, in the sense that I'm also an atheist. I'm someone who certainly always wants to be committed to viewing the world empirically, to not saying things because they feel good, but because they're true. On the other hand, I'm also someone who goes on meditation retreats. I'm kind of a Sam Harris style atheist, quasi-Buddhist.
Right.
I see the value of spirituality shorn of irrational beliefs. And one reason I think we, so to speak, are perhaps losing, if I don't want to frame it as a battle, but in the marketplace of ideas, the ideas you and I tend to push, which are fairly similar, are not winning the day. I think that's clear to say, right? But I think one reason that...
No, but continue.
You don't think so?
No, I know what you mean, but anyway, go ahead.
Let me put it this way. One way in which my narrative could feel much stronger and more viscerally true to people is if it had some kind of religious bent to it.
Yeah.
So, for example, when I think of why it's the case that Martin Luther King was so successful talking about brotherhood and the content of our character, a message that is really universal, but people pushing the same message today just get mocked. I think, well, he stood on this religious perch from which he could view the divisiveness of the Black Power movement and white racists as petty and terrestrial relative to the unity that he could say is true of our world in virtue of his being a Christian. He had a meta-narrative that kind of dissolved all of the divisive narratives below. And I find, as an atheist, entering this conversation that has a very religious character, I lack a meta-narrative. You lack a meta-narrative. So I think that's a liability for us. And I don't know exactly, that's kind of what Yasha's question exposed to me. And I don't know exactly whether that's fixable, but it's something I noticed.
That is, I completely get you, but there are two answers. First of all, and here's where I'm going to have to strike that, well, you weren't around when... No, and we're only talking about 20 years ago. That
was an amazing noise.
Looney Tunes old man voice. But back in the day, as in like 1999, to have the kind of message that you and I have, it's interesting the way these days Twitter is discussed by regular people on Twitter, and people talk about the flaming and the vitriol, etc. My thought has always been, people have been treating me that way since the Clinton administration. It's not new to me, because if you were a black apostate, boy, did you hear it. And the people in the middle that we're talking about, generally you didn't really hear from much. They might write you a physical letter. They might write you a quiet email. But people like that felt genuinely silenced, and I think the mood in the country was different. So when I was you, I got praise mostly from white conservatives, and, that's great. But as far as black people went, there were a few self-identified black conservatives, but for the most part, there was an awful lot of hate. These days, I think that part of the reason you don't get as much of that as I do, part of the reason that I don't feel as hated as I do now, is because there's a middle group, or even a completely persuadable group, who have more of a sense of being a body, who have less of a sense that they're one of only 17 people. And I think social media encourages that. And I find, next time I open up Twitter, I'm going to find all this hate mail. But I find that for the stuff that I do now, I don't get nearly as much of that shit as I used to. There are people who will say, I don't agree with everything, but I respect what you're saying. That group of people is bigger and or louder now than it was 20 years ago. So that I don't feel like we're losing. I feel like we're smoking people out who feel more comfortable than they used to in saying, yeah, for black people, racism is there, but it isn't everything. And I'm not a bad person if I think this. And more black people who do not need to say they're card-carrying Republicans and or my parents are immigrants to say, yeah, this message that we're being given makes us seem like children. So that's one answer. Second answer, religion. People need something larger. Yeah. That's true. You and I sound chilly. But you know what? I think something could replace the religion. And I think that that is something which is going to seem very shallow. We need there to be somebody who does what we do, who sounds better. And what I mean is somebody who probably grew up differently than either you or I did, and who has a much richer, more identifiable Black English cadence and sense of humor than either one of us do. If we could get somebody who had that vocal presence, somebody like Stanley Crouch, who was very useful for that, but he seems to have receded somewhat lately, that would fill in an awful lot of this religious aspect. Because what we're talking about is the viscera. We're talking about warmth. We're talking about sense of belonging. And there'll always be a limit to, I know from my own self, I genuinely feel talking about race, I'm only ever going to be so effective because I sound like this. I do it for someone like you. I do it with Glenn, but I just don't sound right. But if it were somebody like Jelani Cobb, not that he would ever express the views that we do, he would sound right doing it. And so if this keeps going, if there could be a couple of people, and I'm not saying that you or me or Camille or Thomas or Glenn don't sound good, but we need different notes. We need some female notes. It really sounds almost as if it's basically we 5 or 6 guys and then somebody like Candace Owens. There needs to be 5 or 6, black, pliable, heterodox people who don't walk around offending people and frankly who are a little more careful than Candace Owens. I think that we could get somewhere.